Howdy. Welcome to Intensive Review for the South Carolina U.S. History End of Course exam. Today we're going to look at Standard 1.1, which expects the student to summarize the distinct characteristics of each colonial region in the settlement and development of British North America, including religious, social, political, and economic differences. The first thing to know is that not everyone came here for religious reasons. That was a small group of Puritans and separatists who went to the New England colonies. People had many reasons for coming to the colonies. The reasons were primarily religious or economic. The farther north you go, the more religious. The farther south you go, the more economic. Let's keep in mind that there are three sections of colonies, each with their distinct characteristics. The first being the New England colonies, such as Massachusetts, in the northeast here in red on your map. Next, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, such as Pennsylvania, here in green. And finally, in light blue, the southern colonies, such as Virginia and South Carolina. First, let's talk about religion. In New England, religion was a very dominant factor. People came here for religious freedom, so-called. Keep in mind, it's distinct from religious tolerance. The Mid-Atlantic colonies had a limited amount of religious diversity and tolerance, whereas in the southern colonies, religion was not a motive for colonization. Here are the Pilgrims. These were religious dissidents who were run out of England because they did not subscribe to the beliefs of the Church of England. The Pilgrims were separatists. They believed that the Church of England was too Catholic, that the Reformation had not gone far enough in England. And so they decided to go to the New World where they could establish, along with the Puritans, a city on a hill, as John Winthrop called it. John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a Puritan, coined this phrase, which has been used by American politicians from Ronald Reagan to Mitt Romney. We hear about America as a shining city on a hill. And what the people of Massachusetts sought to do was to set up this city on a hill to show the English how it's done right. This was a religious experiment to show that when a society is governed by true religion, then this is how it turns out. Now, although they fled England to get away from religious intolerance, they weren't going to extend tolerance to people that descended from their beliefs, because after all, if we're going to set up this city on a hill, then everyone needs to be on board. Everyone needs to do it right. So there wasn't room for religious dissenters such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams had the nerve to say that people should be able to make religious decisions for themselves. Anne Hutchinson's a whole other story, but for purposes of intensive review, let's just say that she was a religious dissident, that she challenged the religious beliefs and gender roles of the community. Both of these people were exiled from the Massachusetts colony. The Mid-Atlantic colonies had a limited amount of religious toleration and diversity. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker. Quakers believed in the principle of non-aggression. Quakers are pacifists. They don't participate in war. Also, they don't believe in coercing someone to join a religion or to pray to a certain god or to do it a certain way. And so the Quakers in Pennsylvania, who founded this colony, this was the only colony that had a policy of full religious toleration. The Maryland colony was started by Lord Baltimore as a haven for Catholics. This was another group of people persecuted in England. So in these mid-Atlantic colonies, you're most likely to find religious diversity. In the southern colonies, it was all about the Benjamins. The Church of England was established, but in the South, although the South is the most religious section of the country today, religion was not a factor for colonization. So just a quick review of religion. New England, religious freedom, quote unquote, as distinct from religious tolerance. In the mid-Atlantic colonies, a limited state of religious diversity and tolerance. And in the southern colonies, religion not really a motive. Moving on to society. Society in New England was largely egalitarian, dominated by the clergy. And everyone else was by and large on the same page socially, whereas in the southern colonies you had a hierarchical system with landowners being the dominant people there. This was largely due to a system of plantation slavery that existed in the southern colonies, that those who owned slaves were more dominant in the community, they had more money, they had more power and more say. Everyone in the South had a place. And the settlers brought English political traditions with them, such as the Magna Carta, which was signed by King John in 1215 and guaranteed that in order to tax, he would get the consent of the nobles and the clergy, that the king cannot govern alone. The king's not an absolute ruler, that government ultimately derives from the people. The colonists also brought traditions of representative government as embodied in the British Parliament. And so we have these two traditions of popular government and representative government that are going to the colonies. In the New England colonies, this manifested itself in the form of town meetings, which were egalitarian and democratic. All of the men in the community could go to a town meeting, could speak, and could vote. This was everyone participating. Whereas in the South, you had a more aristocratic system, embodied in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. But although this was an aristocratic body, it was also a representative body. The large landowners in Virginia would be elected, and they would get together and they would make decisions for the community. The economy. In New England, the growing season was short, the soil wasn't that great, and so New Englanders who really couldn't grow crops other than crops for subsistence, they couldn't grow anything extra to sell, their economy was based on commerce and shipbuilding and fishing. Whereas in the mid-Atlantic colonies, you had staple crops such as wheat and corn. These crops were largely grown on family farms. Whereas in the South, the economy was dependent on cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. These crops were grown with slave labor. And these colonies worked together in order to get these crops to international markets. The colonies each participated in what was known as the triangular trade. Colonies were there for the purposes of producing raw goods, such as agricultural products, whereas they would be shipped to Europe in exchange with finished goods, and then they would be traded with African slaves. And there were all kinds of things that people could do back then as far as trading goes. If we look at these trade routes, quite complicated. Let's take a quick look here at our port cities because that's in the support document. We can see that our major ports in the colonial period were Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Now, as you can see, all these trade routes can get kind of complicated. And the way the mother country managed these trade routes was through mercantilism, which was a system of economic regulation for the purposes of U.S. history, largely about trade. And the Navigation Acts were the British laws governing trade and navigation. And luckily for the colonists, these weren't strictly enforced. This was known as salutary neglect. Think the speed limit. A lot of times we can go a little above the speed limit, cop's not going to get us as long as we're not going totally overboard. This was the same sort of situation the colonists were dealing with, that the mother country wanted them to trade with England, wanted them to trade with other English colonies, but they weren't necessarily enforcing it. So in reality, the colonies traded with whoever they wanted. This will become a big issue leading up to the American Revolution. So that about sums up our treatment of the colonial period. And in our next segment, we will take a look at institutions of representative government that we have inherited from the British. See you next time.